When the United States entered the Civil War, the Union needed a plan for its conduct of the conflict. General Windfield Scott, the Union's senior military commander, devised a strategy that would play to the Union's strengths and exploit the Confederacy's weaknesses. He hoped it would bring about a swift end to the war and minimize the loss of human life. The plan didn't bring about a swift end to the war, but it did play an instrumental role in the conflict. Learn more about the Anaconda Plan and the Union's grand strategy for defeating the Confederacy on this episode of Everything Everywhere Daily. This episode is sponsored by ButcherBox. Summer is right around the corner, and that means cookouts. No matter what your preferred food is for a cookout or a barbecue, ButcherBox can help you make it the best. If you want to serve up some hamburgers, ButcherBox has grass-fed ground beef to make the perfect smash burger. Want to cook up some steaks? Well, ButcherBox has that too, with some of the best cuts of steak such as New York strip, ribeye, and filet mignon. Do you like grilled chicken? Well, ButcherBox has some of the best pasture-raised chicken that you will find anywhere. And if you really want to wow people at your next cookout, you can try grilling some of their wild-caught salmon on a cedar plank. Sign up at butcherbox.com/daily and get a special deal. ButcherBox is offering my listeners a free for a year offer plus an additional $20 off. You can choose salmon, chicken breasts, or steak tips free in every order for a year. Sign up today at butcherbox.com/daily and use code DAILY to choose your free for a year offer, plus get $20 off your first order. This episode is sponsored by Harry's Razors. I want to tell you a quick story. Several years ago, I was a podcast listener just like you, and I was listening to one of my favorite history podcasts. One of the ads on the show was for a company called Harry's Razors. I was extremely dissatisfied with the razors I was using at the time, so I figured I'd give these Harry's Razors a try. And it was a great decision, and I have been a customer of Harry's Razors ever since. I use Harry's Razors at home, and I've taken them with me on trips around the world. Not only does Harry's Razors provide a smooth shave, but they do so at a much lower price than their competitors, which, if you've checked out the price of razor blades lately at the store, that is not something to sneeze at. Don't settle for the status quo. You can blaze your own trail with Harry's. Get started with a $13 trial set for just $3 at harrys.com/everything. That's harrys.com/everything for a $3 trial set. Despite the multi-year run-up to the American Civil War, even when it became obvious that a war was a real possibility, there was no plan ever developed for conducting the war that was ever written up. When Southern states actually began seceding from the Union, developing a plan for the war fell upon the head of the American Army, General Windfield Scott. Before I get into the development of the plan, I should first explain who Windfield Scott was, because he's really one of the most underappreciated people in American history. Winfield Scott was the longest-serving general in American history and one of the longest-serving soldiers in history. He joined the military in 1808, served in the War of 1812, was promoted to general in 1821, and elevated to the commanding general of the American Armed Forces in 1841. By the time the Civil War started, he was at the end of a very long military career. If you were to map his career onto the 20th century, he would have served from well before the First World War all the way through to the first years of the Vietnam War. The plan that Winfield Scott came up with in early 1861 wasn't a military plan per se. It didn't have anything to do with units maneuvering on battlefields or even raising troops, although that would come later. Scott's plan was first and foremost an economic plan. It was designed to play to the strengths of the Union and exploit the weaknesses of the Confederacy. Scott also wanted a plan that would minimize the number of deaths on both sides, as there would be Americans on both sides of the fight. His plan was to put an economic blockade on the South, preventing them from exporting cotton to England, which was far and away the biggest part of the Southern economy. Not only would a blockade hurt the Southern economy, but it would also prevent arms from being imported to the South from Europe. The Union had a much larger industrial base than the South and was capable of creating a large number of arms. By crippling the Southern economy, eventually the North would win by sheer economic force. The Union also had a much larger navy than the Confederacy, and they had a greater shipbuilding capacity than the South. So, as the war dragged on, the Union advantage in ships would only grow larger. It was called the Anaconda Plan, because it was envisioned as being a large snake that surrounded the Confederacy. It would go down the Atlantic coast from Virginia to Florida, and then cover the Gulf Coast from Florida to Texas, but mainly to New Orleans. Then it would involve gaining full control over the Mississippi River. When war finally broke out, President Lincoln wasn't initially a supporter of the plan. He wanted a quick end to the war, not to see it drag out until the South had to economically submit. That could take years. On April 19, 1961, Lincoln did issue the proclamation of blockade against Southern ports, but it didn't result in any immediate action. He likewise created a blockade strategy board which would prioritize how they were going to enforce a blockade over 3,500 miles of coastline and a dozen major ports. While planning for the blockade went ahead slowly, the more direct approach was being taken on the battlefield. Lincoln wanted to march into Virginia, capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, ending the war in one fell swoop. Needless to say, that didn't happen. The first major battle of the war, the First Battle of Bull Run, was a major defeat for the Union. After Bull Run, Lincoln realized that his quick victory wasn't going to happen, so he put more resources into the Anaconda Plan. At the start of the war, the Union only had 90 ships, 42 of which were steam-powered. That was much better than the Confederacy, but certainly nowhere near the number of ships of a European power like Britain, France, or Spain. One of the first priorities was a campaign of shipbuilding and retrofitting merchant ships to warships. To give you an idea of how aggressive the Union shipbuilding program was, they went from 90 naval ships at the start of the war to 641 at the end of the war. As these ships came into service, it was the job of the Blockade Strategy Board, under the leadership of Assistant Secretary of the Navy Gustavus Fox, to prioritize which ports would be focused on first. There were two blockade zones that were established. The first ran the length of the Atlantic seaboard down to the Florida Keys. And it should be noted that the Florida Keys and Fort Jefferson, the largest brick masonry structure ever built in the Americas, were in control of the Union for the entirety of the war. The second zone went from the Keys down the Gulf Coast to the Mexican border. The Atlantic coast was a much higher priority than the Gulf Coast because that was where most of the major Confederate ports were, with the most direct routes to England. The Union began a series of conquests of important ports along the coast. The battles to take these port cities do not get as much attention as the ground battles during the war, but they were very important in the strategic outcome of the conflict. Hatteras Inlet, North Carolina was captured on August 29, 1861. Port Royal, South Carolina was captured on November 7, 1861. New Bern, North Carolina was captured on March 14, 1862. Fort Pulaski, Georgia was captured on April 11, 1862. New Orleans, Louisiana was captured on May 1, 1862. And Norfolk, Virginia was captured on May 9, 1862. Losing all of these major ports was devastating to the South. But it wasn't totally crippling. For starters, several major ports, such as Charleston, South Carolina, had not been captured. The blockade wasn't perfect, and there were many ships that got through. An entire industry in blockade running arose. Most of the blockade runners were fast, British-built ships that were designed for speed, not carrying large amounts of cargo. They would usually go from southern ports to neutral ports in the Caribbean, such as Nassau in the Bahamas and Havana in Cuba. From these staging points, goods could then be transferred to Europe or directly back to Confederate ports. Early in the war, the blockade runners were very successful, but over time their success diminished as the number of Union ships increased and the number of captured southern ports grew. Once the Union began seeing success along the Atlantic, they moved into the next phase of the operation, which was the Mississippi River. The Mississippi and the entire Western theater was ignored when the war started, but it eventually was given the attention that was required. The capture of New Orleans in the spring of 1862 effectively prevented anything coming down the river from being exported. However, the Union wanted to completely control the river. 12 days after capturing New Orleans, the Union went upriver and captured Baton Rouge. And they also controlled much of the river to the north. The last thing that was preventing the Union from totally controlling the Mississippi River was the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg was located on high bluffs overlooking a sharp bend in the Mississippi River, making it a natural fortress. It was heavily fortified and considered virtually impregnable. Whoever controlled it controlled the river traffic and the surrounding region. The Battle of Vicksburg will be the subject of its own episode in the future, but suffice it to say it was the largest siege of the war and in many respects totally changed the idea of what siege warfare was. And it also made the reputation of the Union general in command, Ulysses S. Grant. Having taken Vicksburg, the Union not only controlled the entire Mississippi, but also managed to split the Confederacy in two. Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas were now separated from the rest of the southern states. This was devastating to the Confederacy because the states east of the Mississippi were primarily focused on cash crops for export. The states west of the Mississippi primarily grew food and were the breadbasket for the Confederacy. Not only couldn't goods flow between the Confederate states, but neither could soldiers that could reinforce the army under Robert E. Lee in the east. Likewise, the Union was able to use the entire length of the river to transport and resupply its troops. Control of the Mississippi wasn't the end. The Union continued to capture southern ports, this time focusing on the neglected Gulf Coast. The Union briefly captured Galveston, Texas in October of 1862. They took Mobile Bay, Alabama on August 23, 1864. And finally, Wilmington, North Carolina was captured on January 15, 1865. By 1865, the Confederacy was nearing total collapse and exhaustion. The losses they suffered on the battlefield were aided by the collapse of the Confederate economy, which was in no small part due to the Anaconda Plan. The inability to easily sell cotton to English mills resulted in a lack of revenue. So, to pay for the war, the Confederacy had to print money, which resulted in severe hyperinflation. By the war's end, Confederate currency had depreciated to the point where it was nearly worthless. The encirclement of the South, as well as the disruption of the flow of goods across the Mississippi River, resulted in food shortages all across the Confederacy. On two occasions, General Robert E. Lee entered Union territory, resulting in two of the largest battles of the entire war, the battles of Antietam and Gettysburg. One of the rationales for these forays into Union territory was to get much-needed food and supplies. The blockade also had compounded the lack of industrial capacity that the South had. It made it difficult for the South to get the arms and weapons necessary to fight the war because European markets were closed off to them. In the end, the Anaconda Plan was what you would call a successful failure. The plan was never implemented as it was originally envisioned by Windfield Scott in 1861, who retired just months after designing the plan. It was slow to be implemented and took years for the requisite number of ships to be built and to take full control of the Mississippi River. Despite all of the effort put into the blockade, the Union was never able to completely stop blockade runners and stop all goods from entering or leaving the South. However, in the end, it was good enough. It didn't have to be perfect. It just needed to make life in the economy of the Confederacy difficult, which is exactly what it did. The executive producer of Everything Everywhere Daily is Charles Daniel. The associate producers are Benji Long and Cameron Keever. I want to give a big shout out to everyone who supports the show over on Patreon, including the show's producers. Your support helps me put out a show every single day. And also, Patreon is currently the only place where Everything Everywhere Daily merchandise is available to the top tier of supporters. If you'd like to talk to other listeners of the show and members of the Completionist Club, you can join the Everything Everywhere Daily Facebook group or Discord server. Links to everything are in the show notes.